iGlobenews is very pleased to welcome our listeners to another edition of iGlobenews Pods. You can find all our podcasts, including this one, on our YouTube channel. Please visit us at www.iglobenews.org and join the iGlobenews community by signing up to our newsletter. Joining us today is iGlobenews Advisory Board member and guest contributor, Professor Susanne Weigelin-Schwiedrzik. And the title of today's interview is The Geopolitical Implications of the U.S. Withdrawal from Afghanistan and China's New Role in Afghanistan. Let me start by a brief introduction of Professor Weigelin-Schwiedrzik. You are a world-renowned China expert and you speak fluent Chinese. You hold a PhD from Bochum University and have taught modern China studies at Heidelberg University and at the University of Vienna, whose sinology department you chaired for 12 years. You have studied in China and have multiple affiliations with many top international universities in the US, China, Hong Kong, South Korea, and Japan. You have 40 years of experience in traveling to and doing research in China, which resulted in over 200 publications in multiple languages. Your research is focused on modern and contemporary Chinese and East Asian history and politics of memory in the People's Republic of China. In addition, you publish on Chinese politics with a more recent focus on international relations. You are currently working on a history of Asia during the 19th and 20th century together with Wolfgang Schwendker. So let me start our interview by first welcoming you to iGlobenews Pods. Thank you very much for coming on our show.
Thank you very much for having me.
The Cost of War project of Brown University estimates that 243,000 people have died as a direct result of the US war in Afghanistan. This figure does not include deaths caused by disease, loss of access to food, water, infrastructure, and other indirect consequences of the war. The monetary cost to the US is estimated at $2.3 trillion. The US left Afghanistan and the Taliban very quickly have taken control of most of the country and have just introduced their interim government. China and Russia have maintained their diplomatic representations in Afghanistan. On July 28th of this year, China's State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi met in Taijin with a visiting delegation led by head of the Afghan Taliban Political Commission, Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar, who has now just been appointed the deputy leader of the new Afghan government. Wang Yi said that China, as Afghanistan's largest neighbor, has and will respect Afghanistan's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. He said that China will not interfere in Afghanistan's internal affairs, and it will pursue a friendly policy toward the entire Afghan people. My question to you is, what will China's role be now that the US has taken itself out of the equation?
Well, for China, this is a big challenge because Afghanistan and the situation in Afghanistan is not so easy to handle, as we know. And as the leadership in China knows, this is very tricky business, very, very dangerous business. However, I think that China has made preparations for the day of the US leaving the country early on. So we know that, for example, Chinese merchants have been going to Afghanistan since 2001, and that there are actually many, many everyday things that you can buy in Afghanistan, which would not be there if China would not make sure that these goods would enter the Afghan market. So from this point of view, they already sort of showed their presence in this country early on, and in a sector where the US and its allies did not show any activity, which is sort of to help the people solve their everyday problems, which of course has quite an impact, I think, on the sort of emotional side of things. Mm-hmm. And I think China has been doing quite a good job in sort of preparing for the time after. And on the other hand, China was very glad to see that the US and its allies were investing so much effort into sort of handling Afghanistan because China is extremely afraid of Afghanistan being used by Xinjiang oppositional forces to get training and get prepared for re-entering the country and making terrorist attacks in China or in Xinjiang. So from a Chinese point of view, with the US so much engaged in what was going on in Afghanistan, China could sort of look at the other side of things and at the same time be comparatively sure that Afghanistan would not be a place where their Xinjiang people could sort of retreat to in order to get prepared for major terrorist attacks in China.
So you talked about many different aspects of China's involvement. So with throughout this interview, I hope that we can then break it down to the various positions, which we can discuss then in detail. But before we go into that, maybe we make a quick detour to the internals of Chinese politics themselves, namely, which part of this policy would you say is Xi Jinping's policy, or are there other forces now that are coming up in the Chinese politics?
Mm-hmm. I think it is quite interesting to see that the people who speak about this situation in Afghanistan are not the so-called wolf diplomats. The wolf diplomats, which have put themselves very much at the forefront of what we sort of observe as China's foreign policy, are silent on this issue. Very interestingly, and even people who would be spokespersons of the foreign ministry and tend to go more into the wolf diplomat direction are comparatively nice and calm when they talk about Afghanistan. And I think this relates to what I just said in the answer to your first question. So for China, the situation in Afghanistan is not clear at all. And they have actually benefited quite a lot from US engagement in Afghanistan, also because US engagement in Afghanistan made it impossible for the US to be more direct in its attempt to sort of coerce China or at least limit its spheres of influence. So from that point of view, they are now it is more the sort of calm side of the foreign ministry, which is actually voicing its opinion. And one does not really know whether or not Xi Jinping is behind this, because Xi Jinping has also backed wolf diplomats. So one cannot say that he is, the person at the head of the party that is against the wolf diplomats. And also we cannot say that he is the person at the party that actually supports the wolf diplomats, because he will choose different situations and decide whom to sort of push in this or that situation. And this is the consequence of his position inside the party not being clear at all. We usually read in the newspapers that he is the most powerful person in the world, and that, when he decides this is right, then everybody in China will do what he wants. And when he decides this is wrong, then everybody will go against it. This is not true at all. And it's especially not true since the last meeting in Beidaihe, which is a meeting in which the elderlies of the party actually discuss recent issues and future developments with the party leadership. And since that meeting took place in July, we see in the Chinese press coming up multiple opinions which actually contradict each other, which is quite unusual, because we do know that there are always conflicting interests inside the party, but very often we have to read between the lines to find out what these differences of opinion are. However, now we can read articles by different interest groups voicing their different opinions, and they do not voice their difference of opinion with regard to sort of foreign policy issues. But we do know that, or we seem to know, we should be very careful about this, we seem to know that during the Beidaihe conference, there was actually a struggle between the military leadership and the political leadership, especially the wolf diplomat leadership of the foreign ministry, because the military sort of told them that if they go on like this, then eventually the military will have to solve the problem, but they don't think that they are yet ready to solve these major issues which the wolf diplomats keep bringing on the table.
So to put it in a nutshell, we don't really know who's making Afghanistan policy at the moment. Is that an opinion that you would put out like that, or?
No, I do think that they are that they have agreed that they want to go for an Afghanistan in which China plays a major role, but they don't want to support the extremist positions in Afghanistan. In this sense, they are pretty much in line with mainstream international voices on this issue. However, I think they differ from mainstream policies because China is already supporting the government, the Taliban government, in the sense that they're actually sending everyday goods and a vaccination to Afghanistan in order to help the Taliban government to actually consolidate its position.
Yes, China has just announced emergency humanitarian aid in the amount of 200 million yuan to Afghanistan. And as you just mentioned, this includes medicine, food, and COVID-19 vaccines. China is cooperating with the neighbors of Afghanistan, those being Pakistan, Iran, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. And China has stressed that the Taliban government is an interim one, which is one I'd like to go into as a question as well. China and the other neighbors will cooperate on COVID-19 epidemic prevention and keeping border ports open, strengthening management and control on refugees, providing humanitarian aid, deepening counterterrorism cooperation, and conducting anti-drug operation. So what strategy is China pursuing within the geopolitical framework there? And why has it not yet recognized the Taliban government? And could one say that the Taliban are playing China against the West?
Well, to start with your last question, I think definitely the Taliban government wants to play China against the West, but China does not want to be played by the Taliban government against the West. And this is sort of the difficult situation in which China finds itself at this particular moment. And I think what they are trying to do is they would like to have what they call an inclusive government. So this is very much in line with what the EU wants and what the US wants. However, they say, we do recognize the necessity to establish a central government at this moment, although we have not yet convinced different societal forces and organizations to actually form a coalition government with the Taliban in order to actually establish a more inclusive government for Afghanistan. And because that is why they are saying this is a transitional government, because they actually take the argument that the Taliban actually pronounced yesterday, to saying, because we need a central government, we now have a central government made up of Taliban people. However, we actually hope in the future to include more societal forces and interests into this government. So I think if we want to understand the policy that China is actually trying to develop towards Afghanistan, there's one thing that makes China very different from the rest of the world, I would say. Maybe Russia is also more in line with this, but most of the countries wouldn't say this, because according to China's own historical experience, they take the victory in a civil war as a replacement for democratic election. So they say, as the Taliban actually won the civil war, this shows that they have the support of the majority of the people in Afghanistan and are therefore, in this sense, legitimate. And I think this is very, very interesting because it relates to China's own historical experience back in 1949, when the Communist Party of China claimed legitimacy for its rule because it had conquered the majority of the territory in China, and therefore said, if we can actually rule most of the territory of China, then this shows that the population is actually supporting us, and this shows that we have the legitimacy to rule over the whole country. And I think this is a major assessment that the foreign ministry has repeated time and again. And this is something we have to have in mind, because it tells us that I think even if the Taliban will not go for a coalition government, which China would like to happen, I think eventually China will decide that because the population is supporting the Taliban, that is why they can actually acknowledge the Taliban government. I think it's only a question of time, and they would prefer for the Taliban to go into an inclusive government direction. But if this doesn't happen, I don't think that China will sort of pull back. I don't think so.
So because like some voices in the US, also from the military side, have now voiced the opinion that Afghanistan is entering a period of civil war because there are these fights going on. Journalists are not allowed or cannot get really any information because there's also like no internet or telephone connections to that area. But you feel that the Chinese, for them, it's already a fait accompli and they've already thrown their weight in with the Taliban.
I think they know from their own historical experience that if you say they're legitimate, sooner or later they will be legitimate. So that's why they are sort of pushing for the Taliban government to sort of go through a first phase of consolidation. That's why they're actually giving humanitarian aid to them, because they think that if the people can relax a little bit, if they feel that the Taliban government is actually taking care of their needs, then the possibility that a civil war will go on for a longer period of time will be enormously reduced. And I think that, as a matter of fact, many things that are happening in Afghanistan today, or that have been happening in Afghanistan during the last years, are indeed very similar to what we know about Chinese history between 1945 and 1949. And my feeling also from the wording of what they say is that they're very much drawing onto this experience. And in this sense, it's also very interesting for us to see how they, for example, push for a coalition government, which the US and Russia did also in China in 1945. But the Communist Party of China and the Kuomintang both did not accept this advice and went for civil war.
So, of course, you have a very unique perspective here, knowing so much about China and how they would look at the situation in Afghanistan, which, of course, many in the West cannot know just because they don't have the knowledge that you have. So thank you very much for sharing that. So the way I understand what you've just said is that China is more or less not going to recognize the Taliban government, but they're trying to maybe, as you said, make it more inclusive, which might include women, or hopefully will include women. But on the other hand, if they don't, that'll be okay as well, because there are guys.
Yes. And Chinese policies towards Afghanistan is very realistic. So they're actually not on a value-based sort of way of dealing with foreign policy issues. We do know this from other places in the world, for example, Africa. But I think it is also very interesting to see that they don't actually define conditions as, for example, the EU did. If you do this or if you do that, then we will be willing to collaborate with you. Because for China, the issue is too important. China only has a border of 75 kilometers with Afghanistan, but it calls itself the biggest neighbor, right? And this shows that this little piece of border is so important for China. And so for China, there is no way to back out of Afghanistan. There is only a strategy to build up leverage in having influence on what is going on in Afghanistan, without interfering the way the US and its allies did, because this is something that China criticizes very openly and says, there were always these foreign forces interfering. We won't make this mistake again, but we will, of course, sort of coach the Taliban government into taking the right decisions.
Yes, I mean, that's something one always hears from Chinese scholars and from the official Chinese side, that they do not want any involvement in internal affairs. And I guess that is their policy when it comes to their external affairs as well. Regarding Pakistan, which of course is an ally of the United States and the West, but also has very close connections to China, how will this affect that whole region there? Will Pakistan end up moving closer to China and away from the West, or will Pakistan play both sides? What do you think?
Well, as a matter of fact, it's quite interesting that you don't read a lot about Pakistan in Chinese media at this moment. And I think the reason is that the situation is quite unclear, and China has a lot of vested interest in Pakistan. And of course, one of the reasons why China is so worried about the situation in Afghanistan is what we just said, because of this 75 kilometers border between China and Afghanistan. But on the other hand, it is also very worried because of the long border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And so if Afghanistan actually becomes a hotbed for future terrorist attacks, then this does not only mean that maybe there will be terrorist attacks in the US and in European countries, but this will especially mean that there will be terrorist attacks in the neighboring countries. That is why China and Russia already sort of tried to link to the neighboring countries of Afghanistan, including Pakistan, before actually this breakdown of the government in Kabul already was observable, because they sort of understood that the situation was getting worse and worse for the government, and that with the outflow of refugees from these countries, from Afghanistan, these countries would have lots of new terrorists within their sort of population, and that this would actually make the whole region very, very insecure. So the whole region, and of course Pakistan here, is the most important country because it plays such an important role in the Belt and Road Initiative.
That is a topic that I also want to come to, the whole Belt and Road Initiative and the role Afghanistan will play. But before we get there, you also mentioned the migrants. And now I'd like to bring in the Europeans, who of course have criticized the US withdrawal, the hasty US withdrawal, where not even many of its own nationals were able to be flown out, let alone those who cooperated with the US. And of course, all over the world, one saw the pictures of the people standing at the Kabul airport. Then we had the terrorist attacks and the death and the suffering that happened there. Will the EU become more independent from the US because of what happened in Afghanistan? And do you think China will support the EU policy on migration, whatever that might end up being? I know at the moment, there is no unified strategy, where some would like to take in more Afghan refugees and others would like to support the refugees in the neighboring countries, which of course would then once again bring China onto the equation, because they have a lot of influence in those countries as well. So how do you see this playing out regarding EU, China, US relationships in general?
Yeah. This is a very tricky triangle, the US, China, and the EU. And of course, from a Chinese point of view, what you want is you want to build a wedge between the US and the EU. And then in a second step, convince more and more EU countries that the best way to preserve world peace is actually to go with China, right? So this is the long-term strategy. And of course, China has not been extremely successful with this kind of strategy, especially since Biden has taken over. Why? Because under Trump, many people in the EU were, very irritated about what was going on in the US. And now with Biden, they seem to calm down and say, okay, this is a politician you can talk to, take rational decisions and things like this. However, I think that the Chinese have observed, rightly, that the way Joe Biden is handling the Afghan situation is quite disturbing. And they would have liked for him, who was always introduced to the public in Europe as someone who is extremely experienced in terms of foreign policy and things like this, they would have liked for him to find a more elegant way to get out of Afghanistan. And as he did not find this more elegant way, there are, of course, now people in Europe who start thinking about the possibility that the US is not reliable anymore. And I think that China is actually using this argument very strongly, both with regard to the EU, but also very much so with regard to Taiwan. So they're telling Taiwan, if you think, you can go on like this and be more and more sort of outspoken in criticizing the one country, two system policy, then you should not think that the US is a reliable partner. So this also shows that, in the region, this Afghan problem is very much linked to the Taiwan issue. And as you see now, the EU is sort of going into the Taiwan direction much more openly than in the past. And Lithuania has renamed the Office of Representation, which in earlier times were called Taipei, now it's called Taiwan, right? And so the EU is actually also playing the Taiwan card, but by playing the Taiwan card, they actually show that they want to be a close ally of the US, right? And if China actually moves on disturbing the situation or the status quo between the PRC and Taiwan, then they have to know that this means that the EU will be on the US side. There's no way for the Chinese to actually make friends with the EU. So this triangle is a super complicated triangle, and it includes sort of other places, including Russia, right? Russia is yet another sort of hidden fourth actor in this triangle. And Russia is also a very important ally of the Chinese in handling the Afghan situation. So at this moment, I would say that, the Chinese actually, with regard to migration policies, opt for having people leave the country and let them stay in the neighboring countries of Afghanistan, manage them well so that there is no outflow of terrorists, which of course would mean a lot of coercion, manage them well to let not outflow any of the terrorists, and then sort of eventually let them come back because they see that the situation in this neighboring country is not good for them. So I think this is the migration policy of the PRC. The PRC is not very experienced in handling migration issues, as we know, for example, from the Vietnam migrants back in the late 1970s. They didn't really know how to handle the situation. So for now, they've already talked to the neighboring countries. And I think yesterday there was yet another video conference in which the Chinese foreign minister participated, which was very much focused on the issue of what is the situation in the neighboring countries of Afghanistan and how can we handle the migration situation. I think from a Chinese point of view, they feel that this so-called openness of the US and of the EU country towards the migrants from Afghanistan is regarded as being very naive, because for them, the main danger is these terrorists, sort of well-prepared terrorists, sort of mingling with those people who really need to leave the country and then sort of going into countries from where they can organize all kinds of terrorist attacks. And as we know from German intelligence services, there are indeed people among those who were actually rescued by Germany who were on the most wanted list in Germany.
Yes, I mean, I think that was also the case back in the big terrorist wave. There were, of course, those sleeper cells that ended up making it into Europe and also were able to do some horrible terrorist acts. So this is something definitely to keep in mind. Now that we're on the terrorist issue, during the Taliban's visit with Wang Yi in July, Wang Yi stressed that the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, the ETIM, poses a direct threat to China's national security and territorial integrity, and that China expects the Afghan Taliban will make a clean break with the ETIM, which for them is a terrorist organization. Will the Taliban seek to have a connection with the Uyghurs in China, or will they follow China's wishes and outlaw the ETIM? Some experts have said that the Taliban may keep some terrorists in the country as bargaining chips to make deals with other neighboring countries and major powers worldwide, saying it is unrealistic to expect the Taliban to have a clear and absolute cutoff with all terrorists in Afghanistan at this moment. What is China expecting, especially in light of its Uyghur population and the ETIM?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I would say, I always stress that I don't conceive of the Communist Party of China as a monolithic institution. Well, according to what I read in the Chinese press and elsewhere, I don't think we should think of the Taliban as a monolithic movement. And when I read the Chinese press, I find quite interesting that they stress how difficult it is for a political and military organization having gone through civil war and finally being the ruler of a country, but only knowing how to go for war, but not knowing how to actually rule a country peacefully. And at the same time, sort of preserve legitimacy and find a way out for not only themselves, but also for the rest of the population. And this, again, is very much the CCP's own experience, right? So the CCP had a great advantage because before 1949, part of the organization was actually located in the cities. So they knew the cities, and usually the cities are the centers from which you rule your country, right? And in the city, you have the people who have the knowledge and experience of ruling a country. However, the biggest part of the CCP was like the biggest part of the Taliban. It was a guerrilla army, right? And these people who had been fighting for so many years, like the Taliban, they simply didn't know how to rule the country, and they didn't want to lose their legitimacy as fighters by actually having to do things that usually fighters don't do. For example, you have to accommodate certain forces you don't really like. Maybe 10 weeks ago, you were still fighting against them. Now you have to somehow talk to them, form a coalition government or something, right? And so I think that is quite interesting that the Chinese government sort of stresses this enormous difficulty of moving from being guerrilla to being a government. And that is also the reason why they stress it is so important that we have an inclusive government, because this implies that you can include certain people who are not fighters, who actually have the experience of ruling a country. And I think this is actually something which they find very, very important. And why do they find this very important? Because they feel that the danger of these fighting people leaving Afghanistan, because they don't think they have anything to do in Afghanistan, the only thing they can do is actually fighting. So they feel that these people can actually sort of take the decision to say, okay, Afghanistan is now under Taliban rule. Let's go for other places and see that we can continue to fight, because fighting is what we can do and fighting is what we know best. And this is the reason why I think they try to sort of form a coalition of all neighboring countries, trying to sort of actually have this outflow of people under control.
But will the Taliban crack down on all the terrorists, or will they actually keep some in their country as a bargaining chip?
I would say they are unable to control the so-called, I wouldn't say terrorists, I would say extremist forces. These are the forces who only know how to fight and don't know how to rule. They're unable to control them or to expel them from access to resources and government positions and things like this. Why? Because these people say, you know what? You can't rule the country unless you acknowledge that we conquered the country for you, right? And so if they, now say, but, if we include you into our government, then all the other countries will not support us. And then these people say, yeah, this is exactly what we're fighting for. We wanted to have a clean country, an Islamic country, a country that is not dependent on any foreign forces. So you have to include us. For that reason, I think the Taliban government will not be able to exclude these forces or expel them or don't give them access to resources. And secondly, I don't think that we can expect a group of people that have actually been going through so many years of war and civil war to now sort of be looked upon as the 100% rational actor. We think, in foreign policy, we have to think of rational actors taking their decision. Here I have a bargaining chip, here I can use it. Oh, be careful, maybe not everything is so rational.
So the Taliban, in order also to appease the Chinese, you think they will help them crack down on the Uyghurs?
They will have to do something to make the Chinese believe that they are cracking down on Uyghurs, but I don't think that they have the ability to crack down on Uyghurs, especially as everybody knows that the part of the country in Afghanistan, which actually is this 75-kilometer border area, is a part of the country that has never been under central rule.
So you can't really know how the porous borders there maybe.
Yes, of course, the Chinese are trying to do their best, right? And I saw a documentary recently, where they explained, how well they have, everything in this region under a military guard. But I think they know very well that it is nearly impossible to hinder people from going back and forth.
So the Chinese might use their new role in Afghanistan also to overcome some of the difficulties they've had with Europe, also with regard to the human rights situation within China, and use that as a backdoor to maybe come closer to the European Union.
Well, I don't really see that China would be able to draw closer to the European Union by using the Afghan situation. Of course, the European Union is also very glad to see that somehow China doesn't want to have terrorists in Afghanistan. So, and I think that even some newspapers are trying to sort of make China really big in Afghanistan in order to convince us readers that, now China will take care of Afghanistan and this will be good for us and bad for China. So a win-win situation for Europe. However, I feel that the human rights issue, which the EU has put on the agenda, both in dealing with Afghanistan as well as in dealing with China, is a major problem in the future development between China and the EU, because China will now convince even more people among the Han Chinese in the People's Republic of China that it has to be very coercive in Xinjiang in order to prevent people from Afghanistan coming into Xinjiang and then using Xinjiang as a hotbed in China for future terrorist attacks. So the legitimacy of the coercive actions that the Chinese government has been undertaking during the last years against the Uyghurs will have even more support by the Han Chinese majority. And what the Chinese have been doing in Xinjiang so far is actually very much focused on the support of the Han Chinese majority in China. And they want to sort of make them believe that the central government is strong enough to protect them from any kind of terrorist attack.
Thank you for that very conclusive and interesting view on the issue there. Let me move to another area. In 2010, US military officials and geologists revealed that Afghanistan is sitting on $1 trillion worth of minerals, including lithium and rare earth metals. This in itself makes Afghanistan very attractive to China and also to other powers. Is China primarily interested in these precious minerals when it comes to Afghanistan? And will they incorporate Afghanistan into their Belt and Road Initiative? The Taliban have voiced an opinion that they would very much like to become connected with China's Belt and Road Initiative and with the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Will China incorporate Afghanistan into this Belt and Road Initiative?
I certainly think so. I think that from a Chinese point of view, Afghanistan is a country, first of all, in which China can invest enormously in order to rebuild the country and in order to actually suggest to the Taliban to take over China's development model. And secondly, we talked about the merchants going to Afghanistan to actually supply the population in Afghanistan, and not only in Kabul, I must say, but all over the country with everyday necessities. China also made some attempts under the previous Taliban government to actually buy resources and claims in Afghanistan. And although they were successful in striking these deals, it never came to the point that they really actively started sort of working in Afghanistan on this issue because of the civil war situation. And it was simply too dangerous for Chinese engineers and workers to go into the country and actually do what they think needs to be done there. So, but the fact that they have already developed these relationships under the former government shows us that China is knowledgeable about the situation. It knows that starting from oil, it can have all kinds of natural resources from Afghanistan. And that, I think, is the main reason, except from the terrorist problem we just talked about a moment ago. It's the main reason why China has been sort of building up multiple relationships, both with the former official government, both with the former official government as well as with the Taliban.
So you see that officially they might be made a part of this Belt and Road Initiative, or will they just have very strong economic relationships with China?
Well, as we just discussed, China is moving into Afghanistan in a very, very pragmatic way. So they will take what they can get. But I think their overall strategic goal is, of course, to include Afghanistan into the Belt and Road Initiative, and maybe eventually even into the Shanghai Five Cooperation Organization.
So that's very interesting also for maybe other players, large players, who would also maybe be interested in the rare earths and the lithium, which is stored in Afghanistan. So more or less, maybe at the moment, it looks like the West and the US are saying, China and maybe even Russia, go ahead, it's all yours. Do you think that's a smart move?
No, it definitely is not a smart move because I think, first of all, Russia has lots of experience in Afghanistan. China does not have lots of experience in Afghanistan. So for that reason, for China, it is very important to collaborate with Russia on Afghanistan. And also they don't want to harm Russia, right? So they want to show that they are friends in dealing with the situation in Afghanistan. And so what does that mean? Well, of course, the Russians have very bad experience in Afghanistan, and they don't have the surplus capital that needs to be invested for rebuilding Afghanistan. But they also don't want to lose their influence in the region. Okay, so what do? They try to collaborate. And this collaboration is yet another stepping stone in a future alliance between Russia and China, which, according to my assessment, is not 100% what Mr. Putin wants. But Mr. Putin already showed us that if there is no way out for him, if there is no alternative to building an alliance with China, he will build an alliance with China. And just imagine in what situation we will be in as a EU if China and Russia actually go together. First of all, we just talked about Taiwan, right? If China and Russia go together in building alliance, then China can attack Taiwan, and the EU and the US will sit there and say, "Oh my gosh, what are we supposed to do? We can't do anything," right? And so I think, leaving the Afghan area to Russia and China means not only that they're going to have yet another place where they can develop their sphere of interest, which maybe is not exactly in our interest, but it also means that they're actually drawing together much more closely than in the past. And this is, I think, something we should not let it happen without us interfering or having at least a foot in this game.
That's a very important point, which brings me maybe to my final group of questions regarding money. So there have been sanctions, which the West has now imposed. And of course, the Taliban at this moment are in urgent need of capital. There are shortages of foreign reserves, and the Taliban want to restore normal relations with many in the international community, including the European Union, and they have also said with the United States. Yet at present, they are facing a humanitarian catastrophe. Will China financially support the Taliban government? What could this support look like, and what will the Chinese get in return?
Mm-hmm. I think the Chinese will try to support the Taliban government, also financially, because, as we just said, what they want is they want to help the Taliban government to go through a period of consolidation so that this civil war will not break out, or if it already broke out, will die down soon, right? So from this point of view, they will try to do everything in their might to support the Taliban government. However, one has to know that the fiscal situation of the Chinese state is not enormously good at this moment. And even for a country as a communist country like the People's Republic of China, you cannot go totally against the rules of the game with regard to your fiscal situation, right? All in all, China's governments on all levels are in debt, and it's 200% of GDP. So the country is in trouble. We always speak about China being the only country in this COVID crisis that is developing well and has no major problems. It's not right. It's not right. And so I do think that from the Chinese point of view, they would even hope, at least for an initial stage, for the EU and the US to participate in the rebuilding and consolidating of Afghanistan, because they know quite well that they cannot shoulder it all by themselves. And I think for those people in China who still exist in the Foreign Office, right, jointly managing the Afghan question would be a wonderful platform where China could still talk to the US, talk to the EU and other countries, including Russia, with a common aim and not always in conflict. And so for that reason, I think there is some necessity for the Chinese to actually think about, how do we get more and more actors involved into the Afghan situation? And I think, on the other hand, the Taliban are knowledgeable enough about the international situation to know that if they depend on only one country or maybe two countries, Russia and China, this will not be enough for them, and it will actually make the situation more difficult for them. So their bargaining chips, which they will maybe develop with time, are much better to use if you can sort of have multiple actors in your country.
Thank you very much. I think that was a very good final statement for our very, very interesting interview. Thank you, Professor Weigelin-Schwiedrzik, for coming on our program. Unless you have any other thoughts you would like to share with our iGlobenews audience, I would say
that's it.
That's it.
Okay,
excellent.
Thank you very much for the wonderful questions. I think I'm sort of a little bit worried that both in the US and in Europe, people don't think enough about China when they think about the world. And I think the situation in Afghanistan shows us very clearly that we can no longer think about the world without thinking about China. And for that reason, I find it very helpful that you gave me the opportunity to actually answer some of your very, very interesting questions. And I hope that the audience will benefit from this.
Thank you very much. I hope so too. And to our audience out there, thank you very much for tuning in to another episode of iGlobenews Pods. And stay tuned for more interesting interviews to come, and join our iGlobenews community. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.